I'm Danielle Robbins with U3 Advisors. I was here for the last case study competition. It's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. But I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes as we wrap up today's boot camp talking about one of the biggest risks to this project, which we touched upon during the panel discussion, which is enrollment risk. I think that a lot of you probably have seen lots of headlines in the news, podcast episodes, segments on nightly news about higher education in America and the changing landscape of it. I think that what colleges across the country, no matter whether they're community colleges, four-year colleges, private schools, public schools, the biggest risk everyone is grappling with right now is the demographic changes in this country. For the last several years now, the size of the American family has decreased. People are having fewer children, but especially after the recession, fertility rates in the country dropped by 17%. So that's going to have huge ramifications for the country as we go forward the next few years, especially as we think about what is the size of the population of students who are actually going to, attend college. Some data scientists have even predicted that between 2025 and 2029, the college-age population between ages 15 and 24 is going to decrease nationwide by 15%, which is very significant. And what that means is that there's going to be a shrinking pool of students that all of these colleges, Lafayette included, are going to be going after. So we want you guys to think really critically during the case about what are Lafayette's chances of actually meeting its enrollment projections, which we're going to give you in the case, and what kind of impact might that have on demand for housing. Just other things to think about is that students and families are a lot more conscious of the cost to attend colleges. They're thinking about, and in many cases are now thinking about potential alternatives. Maybe I go to community college for 2 years and then transfer to a four-year college. Maybe I don't do a traditional higher education, or I go to a trade school. So these alternatives to college are becoming more and more apparent and are increasing competition to schools like Lafayette. And students are really benefiting from this competition. One way that colleges are trying to solve the enrollment problem is by throwing more financial aid dollars to students. So students benefit. Does that put the college in a great financial position? Not necessarily, but it's really a buyer's market here. So the same pool of students that Lafayette is competing for is the same pool that Bucknell, Swarthmore, other liberal art, competitive, prestigious liberal arts colleges are going after. And we wanted to highlight this for you by showing some data on the top 5 states that Lafayette currently pulls its students from and what the demographics look like in those states. And we want you to think about what that might mean for the college in several years. So 20% of Lafayette's incoming class last year came from New Jersey. That's the #1 state that students come from, followed by New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then the rest of the country thereafter in smaller proportions. So let's use Pennsylvania as an example here. So 18% of last year's class came from the state. But when we look at the growth of people aged 15 to 17 in the state of Pennsylvania between 2010 and 2018, there was a decline of 8%. And when we look at the next age cohort above that, ages 18 to 24, there was also a decline, not as significant, but still 5%. And when we look at that 15 to 24 cohort over the next several years, overall it's expected to decline by 2.5%. And you can see that this is the results are similar for these other states. And this is likely to get worse, again, because of the very low birth rate that occurred after the recession. So, Lafayette still does an amazing job at recruiting students. This is an incredibly competitive, highly sought after school. We don't see that changing at any point, but it's just going to make it harder for the college to find more students because there just aren't going to be as many students in the first place to draw from. So how does this tie into housing and demand for housing? So we talked about a lot of these options during the panel earlier today. If you have a developer coming in to build a student housing project, yes, they're going to look at the financial feasibility, what the unit mix could be, but they're really going to be looking at enrollment and whether historically the college has grown or, in worst case, stayed level. And so the best way that a developer could offset that occupancy risk is by entering into a master lease with the university or college. But we talked about the downsides of that. It's a significant financial commitment by the college, and it's because it's a long-time financial obligation that's actually treated by the auditors as a liability on your asset, on your income statement. And if the benefit of working with a developer to finance a project using an alternative source of capital was to remove that risk from your balance sheet, by now basically committing to a 95% occupancy every year, that's a serious financial commitment, and the auditors are not going to let you take that off your balance sheet. We didn't talk about the concept of an occupancy guarantee, which is another type of risk aversion measure a developer will try to get a college to agree to, where, say, the developer requires a 95% occupancy like we talked about earlier, but there's only enough demand such that 85% of the beds are filled. So what the developer is going to come back and ask for is a payment from the college that represents that 10% gap. So this helps the developer to meet its underwriting requirements, but it becomes another financial obligation to the college and another liability that could be added on to its balance sheet. So that's something that some developers came to Lafayette saying that they needed, that they would only do a project if we could guarantee the occupancy, and we said no, because look at the strength of our enrollment, look at the fact that we're a four-year residential college, we are always going to be able to generate students to fill this project, so we don't feel that we need to give you that guarantee. We talked about the occupancy waterfall at length, so I'm not going to get back into it. But one thing we didn't talk about is this concept of decommissioning existing beds. So the idea is that, let's use Watson Courts for an example. Watson Courts is filled with students, but is not necessarily in the greatest shape. The college has been talking for a long time about replacing it at some point. When you take a building offline, those 100 students need to go somewhere. And so if you take a building offline, you have more students that are now in need of additional housing, and they can fill the developer project, they can fill other beds at Lafayette. The problem with doing that, though, is that old assets like Watson Courts, they're 40, 50, 60 years old, they've already had all of their debt paid off. So these types of buildings generate a tremendous amount of cash flow to a college, after expenses are paid. And that because there's no debt on those projects, the college is able to offer those units at a lower price. So Watson Courts, again, it's a tier one building. It's one of the most affordable options on campus. So yes, you could create demand by taking older buildings down, but then you run the risk of replacing those units with more expensive ones, which was a point raised by a student earlier today. How many students are actually available to pay the higher rents of a more expensive replacement project? So I just wanted to show you a tool that we use at U3 to look at enrollment relative to housing inventory, which I think could be helpful for this case study that you're all working on. So these are all just hypothetical numbers, but it helps you look at demand relative to supply and determine whether there's a surplus or a deficit. And then you can start to think about how you address shortfalls if there are in fact any. So let's say this school had a full-time enrollment of 5,000 students this first year, and they expected to grow 2% every year. Let's say they have a target of housing 50% of their students on campus. So there's housing demand from 2,500 students in this particular year. Now we want to look at that demand relative to the school's housing inventory. So let's say they have these 6 residence halls, which vary in capacity between 325, 375 beds. We're not expecting any changes to this inventory over the long term, so these numbers are static. And the school also rents beds in the nearby market. Let's just say they have 375. So they have a total supply of 2,450 beds, but demand for 2,500, and so they have a deficit of 50. So schools get worried when they start to see deficits like this. I would say a deficit of 50 beds is not totally insurmountable. I think there are a lot of ways to address this before you start to build new. You could say convert singles into doubles, doubles into triples. Maybe you release more students from the housing requirement like Roger talked about earlier, or maybe you rent more units off campus than you are already. But if you're in a position where your enrollment keeps growing, but your inventory stays flat, you can see that the deficit starts to get worse over time, to the point where it's probably insurmountable, I would say, once you're facing a deficit of over 200 beds. And so you want to start thinking about, when is the right time to introduce a new building. So let's say that this school decides, well, we can't let our deficit exceed 250 beds, so we want to make sure that by fall of 2023, we are in a position to open a new building to address that. So let's say they they introduce 350 new units at that point. So they've succeeded in closing the deficit. They actually have some wiggle room now. They've got a surplus, but that surplus starts to decrease again as enrollment continues to grow. So this is a dynamic tool that, there are millions of iterations for how this could play out, but we thought it would be helpful for you to look at enrollment and changes in inventory to help determine whether Lafayette has enough beds, or if it needs more. You can play with the enrollment to see, well, what if we just stop growing? Now we have a surplus of beds, probably too many extra beds. So maybe we stop renting as many off-campus apartment units. So we reduce our liability that way. What if enrollment just tanks? What if enrollment just absolutely tanks? Now we've got way too many beds. Well, maybe now is the time to start taking off some of the older buildings that we had been planning to do so at some point, but maybe we start thinking about doing that sooner rather than later. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. Again, we're going to provide you with the enrollment projections, Lafayette's current housing inventory, and the case study. But the case is about more than just completing the pro forma. It's thinking about, what does the future hold for Lafayette? Does it make sense at this point to build a new project? And what does the project look like that supports not only the college's need as we determine it, as we determine what the need is, but also how can we think about bringing exciting uses to the ground floor that make this more than just another residence hall.